Hey, my name is Anisha Patel and I'm obsessed with all things career development. I am a pharmacist turned entrepreneur who's transformed my passions into purpose. I've grown a podcast that has reached thousands of people across the globe. I'm building an online business and I've left my 9-to-5 to chase I've walked this path of transformation myself, and now I'm here to share insights, strategies and stories to help you carve out a career that you love. Career opportunities, personal development, challenges, growth and building life skills are all things we discuss on this podcast. Be prepared to be inspired and motivated to step outside of your comfort zone. This is the Pharmacist Diaries podcast. So I would like to say a massive welcome to the Pharmacist Diaries podcast. We have Steve with us on the podcast today. He is a clinical pharmacist who has been working in the field of pharmacy for over 30 years, 18 of which he's been an independent prescriber across various sectors, and 9 of which as a consultant pharmacist in medicine and medication safety across hospitals. He's really passionate about education and training and research and anything to do with medication optimization and safety. So I'm really excited to learn more about that in terms of his journey. He is currently the medicines optimization team lead across a primary care network in Bournemouth, which is really exciting. And he runs his own medicines optimization consultancy company, One Less Pill, and is co-host to a popular podcast called Oral Apothecary, which I'm really excited to hear more about. We have so much to talk about in this episode, and I'm sure lots of exciting things will come out from Steve's journey. I was just actually saying to him before we started to hit the record button that I don't even know where to start, but my favorite question is usually why you became a pharmacist in the first place.
Hello, thank you very much for having me on. Always a pleasure to come on podcasts, particularly when I'm on the other side of the microphone.
Agreed. Does it feel weird for you? Because I always feel a little bit stranger when I'm on the other side of the microphone.
No, not really. I suppose like anything, you know, if you think that anybody that you know wings it, they don't. So there's always preparation. So yeah, so the preparation really was no different. Well, it was different because obviously it's a different subject because I'm going to have to talk about myself, but it's the same. It's the same concept, isn't it? So no, and I guess what you have to remember is that I love to talk. I love to listen as well. I just like conversation, I suppose. A better description is I think I'm a conversationalist, I think is the way I would describe myself. So, and podcasting is just that, isn't it? It's just talking, that. It's listening, it's stories, it's humor. It goes a bit deep because sometimes, you know, a lot of other stuff, I think other media types are very superficial. And so I just love the medium of podcasting. But if I get back to your original question, I know you always ask your guest, and it's a good place to start. Pretty simple, really. My dad was a pharmacist, and we lived above the community pharmacy in Milford Haven in Pembrokeshire. So I've heard you say before that you got plucked out of one country and plonked in another. So my journey was not as far as yours. I only went from England to Wales. But when I was 16, I moved after my GCSEs to do O-levels, to do my A-levels in Milford Haven. This was before the internet, of course. I knew the sum of this number of people in West Wales, which is 0 for those who are listening. And so, yeah, I guess you've said before about, you know, you get formed, don't you, when you have to, So my dad was a pharmacist. He loved his job. I, lived above the pharmacy, and I was into science. I liked science. I knew I was, wanted to help people. And the honest truth is I wasn't good enough at physics because I think I wanted to do optometry. And I was very clear that I didn't want to look in people's orifices. So dentistry and medicine were out.
Fair enough. I like that. The last 3 interviews that I've done, every pharmacist has said they've had a parent and or a grandparent who's been a pharmacist as well. And that's not normal, like in the grand scheme of me recording episodes with pharmacists, but it's just interesting that we've got the family connection in there. I love that.
Yeah, I think it's when I have medical students in, which is quite often, one of the first questions I always ask them is, have you got any healthcare professionals in your family? Because it's sort of, and often they have, it might be uncle or auntie, and it might be doctor, nurse, pharmacist, but it's often there. Not always, but it's often there.
Yeah, it's interesting. And what did you think during university in terms of your career pathway? What were your thought processes as to what you were expecting to do as a pharmacist way back when?
So I went to Cardiff University, 1988 to 1991. So that dates me as Generation X, and had an absolute ball. I was the chairman of the Welsh Student Pharmacy Association. And that was great. But the honest truth is, I didn't know. So for early parts of my career, there were so many parts to it that I liked that I didn't want to jump ship as to go one way or the other. So I was very lucky at Cardiff. This is 1991, and I've heard other guests come on your podcasts and talk about this in a very different way. But Cardiff was one of the very first universities to make their third year course very, very clinical. So going out and sitting in a GP practice, we did that in third year. Going around the wards at the hospital, we did that. And we went to community pharmacy. So it was very, very clinical. So I got very into that idea. And so having done all the science, I realized that, and probably being a communicator, probably my number one thing, I thought, this is for me. But I couldn't decide whether to work community or hospital. So I applied to both. And I just let luck do its lady luck. And so I didn't get offered the job in community pharmacy before I had already been offered a job at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, because I just thought, I'll just go there. I'll go to London. That sounds like a good plan. Had no idea, no planning. Didn't know what was a good hospital pharmacy or a good hospital. So ended up at the St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London.
As a pharmacist, I know firsthand how challenging it can be to maintain our health and well-being whilst caring for others. I am a true believer of making the time to look after my physical, mental, and emotional health, and I love the idea of using natural supplements to support me on this journey. That's why I was so excited to find The Naked Pharmacy. Their products are 100% plant-based and naturally sourced, 100% biodegradable, and it feels really safe to know that they are formulated, tested, and manufactured to the same standard as a pharmaceutical product. However, the most important fact to share is that their CEO and founder, Kevin Levers, is a pharmacist with over 35 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry. I love that as a community, we can support our pharmacy colleague every time that we purchase a product. As a Pharmacist Diaries listener, you get an exclusive 20% discount off all Naked Pharmacy products using the code PD20. Just visit www.thenakedpharmacy.com and treat yourself to something new. It's quite nice to go on an adventure when you're that age and you're coming out of university and you get to spread your wings and
Brilliant.
You can literally pick on a map, and you don't have necessarily the responsibilities that you might have, once you get married, maybe have children. So you're kind of free to move around.
I would recommend anybody live in London for at least a year. It's phenomenal, particularly when you're, young. So I lived in Kentish Town, worked in Bart's Hospital, walked through Smithfield Market every morning. Friday nights were an absolute blast after work. Everybody went out on a Friday night. Yeah, I loved it for the year. I can't imagine I'd ever would have lived there for very long, but yeah, I did love it. And actually, do you know what? It turned out that, as I've later discovered, that at the time, if I'd bothered to ask anybody, well, I say bothered, remember that back in the day, how would I have found out, actually, what was Bart's pharmacy like compared with all the others? But the bottom line was, it was considered in inverted commas, to probably have the worst reputation for pharmacy.
But then you can implement the most amount of change.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I didn't stick around. I was only there for a year. But what was really, really fascinating is that a lot of years later, talking to people who worked London and had remained in London, I remember talking to them and saying, why was that? And they said, oh, there's a story. Well, there's a story to everything. I've got this thing about, you just don't know, do you? Until you talk to people, you've just got no idea. And the story goes something like this. And I won't say any names, but there's a reason apparently where the chief pharmacist was basically told by the lead clinical pharmacologist at Bart's at the time that there was no way that clinical pharmacy was happening in his hospital and that everything needed to be done in production and aseptics down in the basement. But as a special treat, when they had students, this professor of clinical pharmacology would do teaching. And it was fab because we'd go and see a patient. Let's say we went to see a liver patient on the ward, and then next week we'd go and see a heart patient or whatever. And then after we'd seen the patient, and we'd all gone around the bed and he'd talked to them, and we learned about the patient. We'd go up to the library, and whatever organ we were doing that week, he'd get all the formaldehyde, hearts, lungs, livers, or whatever, and we'd talk about the case. And I think that inspired me, actually. But apparently, that was why the clinical pharmacy service was not as well developed as all the others in London, because the person who had all the power was the professor of clinical pharmacology.
Interesting. That would be quite fun, actually, I think. I would enjoy that. Quite a unique experience, for sure. Why did you only stay there for a year?
Well, because the pre-registration year was only a year.
Oh, sorry, it was your training year.
Yeah, it was my training year. Yeah.
Okay.
So I did a lot of aseptics, did a lot of quality control, all the stuff that now when people complain to me about their trainee year or parts of their trainee year, and I say, look, you've learnt that that's an area you don't want to work in. That's fine. That's good. So
that's what I say. I even say that. I say that to rotational band sixes, because we have band sixes who also do their sort of 3-month rotations, and people don't want to go to certain areas. Like, they're absolutely adamant that they don't want exposure to that area. But I always try to get them to see the positive side of being in it, or it's a really good kind of 3 months where 100% you're sure that that's not the career pathway for you. Yeah. And that's a really good learning experience.
It is. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And the other thing about that, of course, is that even if it's an area that you then realize that you don't want to work in, you can actually meet some fabulous managers or leaders who are not in the field that you're interested in. But when you look back, you go, that person was just brilliant. Or you work in an area that you eventually ended up working in, but on reflection, you think to yourself, that person was a terrible leader or a terrible manager. And I'm not going to be naming names in any of this podcast, but you all know what I mean.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. Like, do you know Mark Borthwick?
I do, a little bit, not very well.
I know he's quite well known in the pharmacy community, but I did my residency in Oxford, and I did critical care as a rotation, and I wasn't that keen on doing an ICU or becoming an ICU pharmacist in any way, but he was incredibly inspirational within my journey, because to see the dedication and the impact that he has in his specialist area, regardless it's not the specialist area that I want to do or that I'm that interested in, just to see how he's embedded himself and the team into the service, how much research they do, how much education and training they do, and being part of that experience in that rotation was really useful for me to see that this could be me in 20 years if I follow the traditional kind of specialist hospital pharmacist role.
Yeah.
So you're right. It's good. Like, the rotational jobs for me are such great exposure to everything in a hospital setting. It's so nice to see all aspects, and not just the clinical exposure, the leadership, the mentorship, the ways that different multidisciplinary teams even work, especially if they've got clinics as well as having ward areas as well. It's nice to see both sides of that as well. So it's really good for young professionals. They've got so much available to them.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I don't know Mark very well, but again, he was a consultant pharmacist, and he actually, do you remember a few years ago, the Pharmaceutical Journal ran a competition to write a short story about pharmacy in the future? And I wrote mine on the train. I remember I was going to Bath, and I wrote my piece, and I was very pleased with it. And Mark Borthwick won. I think there was 3. I think I got highly commended. But I absolutely loved writing that. And actually, on reflection, when I read his ideas were similar to mine.
Interesting.
In relation to this idea that, look, and there's a few words I'm probably going to mention during this podcast, because I'm thinking that a lot of the people who listen are, maybe starting out or, relatively young in their careers. And knowledge is one of these, because I heard Catherine McKenzie say this as well. And I don't know if this is a generational thing for Catherine and myself and probably Mark, is that knowledge is power. So I learnt that early on, and one of my chiefs, Jonathan Cook in Manchester, taught me that as well. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way, but Catherine said something like, when a consultant anaesthetist asked her about this drug, I think it was Atracurium, and she thought to herself, I've got no idea what he's talking about. I don't know anything about that drug. And she said something like, I never wanted that to happen again.
Yeah.
Well, that's me. And I don't know if it's generational, but I worked so hard in the first 10, if you'd met me in my first 10, maybe 15 years of my career, you wouldn't have known who I was. You wouldn't have known what I did. Ravi Sharma blows me away every time I ever hear him, every time I meet him, because over half the pharmacists probably knew who Ravi Sharma was within 10, 13 years of his career. I was just chopping away in the back, right? Learning, sucking up information. I took the idea of becoming a medicines expert incredibly, that was my thing. And so knowledge is so powerful. And so, but actually going back to the story and Mark's case and mine was that in the future, actually the pharmacist became the most powerful person of all the healthcare professionals in the future, because a lot of the other stuff was done by AI. And so actually you need somebody to talk to people about the risks and benefits of taking medication. And so even if you're a cardiologist and said that this person had atrial fibrillation, the patient of the future would then have to talk to their pharmacist to discuss and have a shared personalized person-centered conversation before deciding whether to start a medication, yes or no. And so his was a better story than mine, but it was a similar idea.
I love that. That's a great story. And it's interesting that you think about things from a generational point of view.
I might be wrong about that.
No, I'm just reflecting on like what you've said in terms of your generation feeling the need to be medication experts. Do you think that maybe as time has evolved, that the expectation on pharmacists to be able to do so many things within one job prevents you from becoming a medication expert because there's just so much to do now?
No,
and
not at all. I don't think it's been any different.
Okay, that's interesting.
But my point is, because I could do all those other things as well, I think. And look, like I said earlier, there's a sweet spot between confidence and arrogance, isn't there? So I've worked very hard at knowing what I know, and people, asking me things because of what I've done and what I know. But the point being is that fundamentally, I think anyway, that pharmacists' greatest power, right? If we were superheroes, I'm saying that our superpower is to be the expert about medicines.
Yeah.
And everything else comes after that. What color cape, what color underpants? It's what you know about medicines that is your superpower.
No, I think that's really important to get across as well. Like you said, there's a lot of young people, young professionals listening or potentially watching this podcast episode. That should resonate really well with them, because if you put that at the forefront of your mind as your mission, especially if you're in a patient-facing role or a very clinical setting, and you make that your mission and your purpose and what drives you to become a great clinician, and everything else comes after, then I think it's doable. Because I've asked myself this question, like when I was a resident, we were expected to see maybe 60 to 90 patients a day sometimes. This is when we were still in paper drug charts and we were running around like headless chickens, kind of doing drug histories, medicines reconciliation, clinically screening charts, and discharging patients all day, every day. And I remember kind of feeling that it was completely manageable. Like it was nonstop chaos and I loved the chaos. But I felt really confident with a lot of the clinical knowledge that I had as well. So there was a lot of like speed with work. But as you diversify and you learn new skills, or you have leadership responsibilities, mentoring responsibilities. You have education and training in your role. You might spend less time on the ward, which then means that in order to maintain that knowledge and that power, you have to do it in your own time, which becomes quite challenging for some people.
Yeah.
And I think as a band 6, you're doing your diploma at the same time. So you're constantly immersing yourself and absorbing all that knowledge because you're on the ward all day, every day. But you're also doing your diploma, so you're further enhancing your knowledge at the same time.
Sure. But I guess what I'm going to say is that I did all that. You know, I had to immerse myself. I had to do loads of additional hours to get up to speed. And then when I became a consultant pharmacist, so, you know, I worked in hospital for 25 years before I worked in primary care and was one of the first 30 consultant pharmacists like Catherine McKenzie. And the point about that is you have to do all of those things. You have to be a clinician, or you have to have an expert area, okay, and in advanced practice. Then you have to do research. Then you have to do education. And do you know what's the most difficult part, or what's the most difficult to prove that you're any good at it from the 4 pillars of advanced practice and now consultancy? And that is leadership. That is by far and away the most important thing that consultant pharmacists, in my opinion, should and can do, because leadership is hard, but it can go so far if you get it right.
No, I completely agree with you. It's an interesting, interesting points. But I don't know, I see the younger generation, and I feel like they're a little bit different. Especially because I teach MPharm students.
Yeah.
But also because I see junior pharmacists on the wards on a daily basis. And there is a difference sometimes, I feel, in their capabilities compared to what I was expected to do. And then again, like what your generation was expected to do as well.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if I had somebody sat on my shoulder here, right, about this podcast interview, it would be my co-host of the Oral Apothecary, Jamie Hayes, who I've known since 1988. Okay, we studied together, we've holidayed together many times, we're the best of friends. And he's an executive coach, and he'd say to me, don't fall into the advice trap. In other words, don't give advice. And so the point is, you know, I'm not saying for 1 minute that life, I'm not saying that life now is anywhere like what it was like in the 1990s. I'm not saying that. But I'm talking about the principles.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just saying that the principles of getting good and making knowledge about medicines your superpower as a pharmacist, I don't care what decade you're in, I still personally believe that that is still the case.
I'm going to make that the title of this podcast episode and have like a superhero on the thumbnail.
I'd love that.
Yeah, that's so cool. I'm going to turn you into a superhero on our thumbnail. So anyone watching, check out the YouTube thumbnail.
On my Twitter, my account says something like NHS thinker and doer who always wears his positive pants.
I love that. Putting fun into pharmacy, Steve. I love that.
And going back to what you said about speed, you see, if you get good at knowledge, then it becomes easy. So everything's hard before it gets easy, right? So I worked out recently. So like yourself, you know, I spent many, many, many years providing care for 60 patients a day, right, in a hospital. And I worked out that roughly, I reckon I've helped and looked after and cared for over 250,000 patients in my career of 33 years.
That's very
And so
cool.
you get very good at pattern recognition. I mean, you mustn't get arrogant because, you know, if you do too much fast thinking, you still need to do your slow thinking. And one of my things is that thinking is very underrated in the NHS. But if you get good about being, you know, knowing your stuff, then actually you can do it much quicker. And so that's why I'm saying that your first power should be knowledge about medicines, because then everything else, all that other stuff that comes and it gets complicated and needs to be done, you can almost do the other stuff and have to work hard at it, because the knowledge stuff is there. It's not there. You've still got to keep it up to date. Don't get me wrong, but you've got to get grounded in, the major health conditions and the major medicines to be able to be helpful. I think even if you're working in a specialist area, you still need to be a generalist in relation to medicine's expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me a little bit about your kind of passion for medication safety and medicine's optimization. Where did it stem from? Is there like one of those light bulb moments where you said, oh yeah, tell us.
There's always a story.
I love a story. So
like a lot of pharmacists, we could say this because we are pharmacists, but we're anally retentive, okay? GP friends of mine laugh when I say that. And I say, no, but it's the truth. And I think we self-select into pharmacy a little bit. So, and maybe more of that later, about how sometimes the always wanting to be perfectionist in what you're doing can actually be trouble for you. But the point being, and this idea of why, assume nothing, question everything. For a long time, that's always been one of my mantras. And so I think pharmacists generally are in that kind of field, aren't they? They're in that kind of space. And so what happened one Saturday when I was working at Halton Hospital in Runcorn, which is where I went after I did my year in Barts, then I did a 2-year diploma at Wexham Park Hospital in Slough and did my clinical diploma in Oxford. And then I went to Halton Hospital in Runcorn. And one Saturday I was working, it was a very small district general, probably only had like 250 beds. But I learned so much there because I was able to I was a generalist and I had lots to do. But I was working on one Saturday morning, and one of the nurses that I knew quite well on one of the wards that I usually covered came to me and he said, Steve, and he brought up to the hatch heparin 1,000 units per mil, 5 mils, and heparin 5,000 units per mil, 5 mils, right? So either 5,000 units or 25,000 units. And he said he'd just taken down a pump. He just went to make up a pump, and had got so far as to get somebody to check it with the ampules to realize that he was just making up something that was supposed to be 25,000 units, but it was 5 times that strength because he'd used the 5,000 units per mil instead of the 1,000 units per mil. So that's sound alike salad, right? So the sound alike look alike. And what was clever about it was that he obviously was worried about it, came to me, and he said, oh, I'm worried that others will have done this. So he had the foresight to know that. And I'm also a thinker like that. So kind of big picture, and thought, oh my God, if it happened on that ward, I did a bit of a checking. It's like, we've never ordered 5,000 units per mil heparin ever. So it has to have come in. So I'm already doing the 5 whys in my head. Now, how did this happen? Why did that happen? Why did that happen? And I thought, it must have come in by error. And what we eventually found out was it did come in by error. So the supplier sent it to us. The person who checked the stock, who was an administrative person, didn't spot it. Why would they? It went out, was sent to the ward. They asked for it. They sent it. Nobody mentioned it until this nurse. And what happened was, then on the Monday, I said, we're going to need to find out who's had this. So I had to go to the medical director, and we come up with a plan. And we were lucky because heparin is one of those medicines where you can take a blood test or look at a blood test result to see whether or not you've got an effective dose or a toxic dose. Do you know what we did? We were able to look through the path lab system and retrospectively over the period from when we knew that the stock came in accidentally, and we were able to find all the people with a really, really raised APTT. So in other words, they had a very high level of clotting, a very high level of anticoagulation. And then we had to pull all those notes and discover that most of them turned out there were people who'd been put on a heparin infusion and they'd obviously been made up incorrectly. And bang, that's how I got into medication safety.
So it actually happened to multiple patients?
Yep. And one person of that group, one person did actually bleed seriously. And I'm pretty sure at the time, the medical director was actually a radiologist, I remember. I was pretty junior then. But I think that we agreed that it was impossible to say that had not contributed to that person's death.
Interesting. Well, that's quite a good story to kind of set you up for the rest of your career.
I know.
And have done all the amazing things that you've done thereafter.
Yeah. So there you go. My second word is why. I said I've worked out that I was going to certain words I wanted to get across, and I think they will go across the decades.
There's your why.
The first one is knowledge. The second one is why.
Picture this. You're juggling multiple prescriptions, patient consultations, and endless hours of administrative tasks, all while maintaining a happy work-life balance. It's chaotic, it's stressful, and it's downright exhausting. Or maybe you're a student who's overwhelmed by all your assignments, exams, OSCEs, whilst attending hours and hours of lectures and labs and maintaining an active social life. What if I told you there's a way to streamline your week and reclaim a sense of control over your time? I think I can kickstart that journey. I've created a free PDF guide, 5 steps to streamline your week and add 5 hours to your schedule. In this guide, you'll learn how to optimize your workflow, prioritize your tasks, and carve out precious time for self-care and personal pursuits. Click the link below to grab the guide now. I promise you your future self will thank you for it. I love this. I love a theme in a podcast episode as well.
Yeah.
So tell us, how did your journey then mold? You were a hospital pharmacist. You made this discovery. Did you start getting involved with medication safety or governance or audits during this time because of your interest?
Yeah. So this was back in the 90s. So this was if you remember, all the stuff about medication safety happened in 1999 in America to Err is Human, and then 2000 for the UK. So I'm doing some of this stuff in the late 90s and setting up, before it was a thing, setting up medication safety groups that were multidisciplinary. I just really got the bug. And I think that because I'm a big picture person, as well as I could do detail, but I also like big picture. And I suppose one of the other things I would say is that over my career, and I think this is important here, is that I find that I have always considered my role to be in a multidisciplinary way, not a unidisciplinary way. And sometimes I find that for pharmacists, they become too unidisciplinary. So they might be a pharmacist, and I'm a pharmacist, and they might be a medicines expert, but they don't think about it or act in a multidisciplinary way. Does that make sense? So from early on, I'd be going, like that nurse, for example, I just told you, I'm like, right, you represent nursing that works on the wards, right? We'll get a junior doctor, we'll get a consultant who's interested, we'll get a nurse, and we'll get a couple of other, we'll get a pharmacy technician because they're really important. So that's kind of how we did it. So, and I just got into it more and more and more, basically. And at the time, the other thing I'm probably most proud of when I worked at Halton Hospital, and again in the 90s, before the 2000, two things. You think about electronic discharge systems now, okay? We were doing that in late 1990s. I sat down with a guy from IT and said, this is what we need. And he basically wrote the program so that we could electronically send the discharge letter to the GPs.
That's so cool.
Astounding. And we also set up, I did set it up, but we used a piece of software called Dawn anticoagulation software. And this is where I learned about the power of IT. Because what I learned was that all the patients on warfarin, they were all their INRs and doses that for the last 5 years were just on a piece of paper. Well, they were on a card. And I had to put them all into the system for the system to then be able to offer advice as to what the next dose might be. So here was like an early version of AI, because they said, this system will be able to tell you or advise you what dose to give people. And it could, but it can't do it if you don't tell it what the last 5 INRs were. So I had to do all that. So I learned what is computer logic versus what is human logic. And that became a very important lesson to me. And again, took me into my medication safety world about always thinking about, hard stops and how powerful IT can be to prevent something from even getting off the ground, but realizing that IT still has its limitations. So those were my formative years when, nobody would have known me or what I was doing. I was just going along, doing my business in a very small district general hospital and loving it. And I worked there till 2003. So I was 14 years qualified then. So when Ravi Sharma was just, on top of the tree.
I'm going to have to tell him about this episode because it keeps coming up.
Yeah, of course.
So cute.
So yeah, and then when I went to teaching hospital in Manchester. So I was lucky enough to. I also did a lot of medicines information. Going back to what you asked me when at the beginning about how did I get into deciding what to do, and I told you I didn't know what to do because I liked so many different things. So I did medicines information, which is also a fantastic skill and plays into the knowledge part as well. And so when I went to Manchester, and I became essentially to begin with became the clinical services manager of of a large teaching hospital, because before I left the small district general, the other thing I'd done a lot of is I worked very closely with the pharmacy technicians to create what you probably now call medicines optimization, medicines management technicians. We were doing that in the late 90s. So, we were able to do that. So then when I went to Manchester, that was a real challenge because obviously I'd come from this small little place, and I might have done a bit of auditing, but I certainly didn't have any research background. And that was the big learning curve for me. And also I was questioning myself, if I could do it in a small place, but, where I was a reasonable sized fish in a very small pond, what would happen when I was a very small fish in a very large pond? And you know what? It's the same meat, different gravy. So the process of like how to make change, right? How to lead and change and get allies. That's another one of my words. Okay. Ally. I talked about multidisciplinary, not unidisciplinary. If you don't have allies, you ain't changing anything. And so I learned the power of working with others to ally, to get what it was that I thought was the direction we needed to take. And of course, sometimes I changed my direction because I was influenced by allies who showed me the way that actually what I thought was probably not right. So allying and learning who you can influence and who influences you is another one of my words for today in relation to this podcast. So I just got more and more into it. And then at the time, the chief pharmacist there, Jonathan Cook, really saw, I suppose, something in me. And it was when they were starting to talk about consultant pharmacists. So at this time, I was working solidly clinically. I was working in a medical admissions unit which I absolutely loved. I learned, again, my knowledge level just went through the roof, and my ability to pattern recognition and, see thousands of people with heart failure and what happens if you give them diuretics, and thousands of people who've got Parkinson's disease and what happens if you don't give them their medication for 2 days. And so all of that knowledge that I learned. So I was doing all of that. I became a prescriber. I was working at the diabetic clinic. But it was the medication safety part that I was really, really wedded to. And I started to do stuff regionally. And then it was suggested that I should try to be credentialed in the modern phrasing of becoming a consultant pharmacist. So there was only 3 of us, I think, who became, at the time, consultant pharmacists in medication safety. So mine was actually medication safety and medicine, because I was absolutely adamant that I still was a practicing clinician. So that made my job harder, if you like, but on a lot of levels, it made it easier, because going back to allying and my knowledge, I was able to influence people because I still was doing. And so that became a really powerful part of trying to get change, really. So, yeah, I just went from strength, I suppose, to strength in relation to my medication safety journey.
It sounds like a lot of your sort of skill development comes from the experiences that you had just in your journey.
Yeah.
But was there anything specific that you utilized as a tool to guide you? For example, did you do any courses or anything on leadership or management and understanding your skill set and role modeling to kind of junior pharmacists, technicians, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the early days, when I worked at Halton Hospital, no. But I had another fantastic chief pharmacist called Anne Rickard, who sadly passed away now. But she was an inspiration. And I remember she always used to come in on a Monday after she'd read the pharmaceutical journal. And she'd come in and she'd say, see what they're doing there in Yorkshire or in Bradford or where, London or whatever. We could do that, couldn't we, Steve? We could do that. I'm like, yeah, we could probably if we thought about how we were going to do it. So my point is that even though she was reaching retirement at that time, she was still wanting to change. Okay. And here's another one of my words here, which is change. Okay. So the power of change and realizing that in the NHS, the only constant is change.
It's change.
And if you don't get with the program, you're going to fall behind. And this is where So although I suppose you might say I had some natural skills and abilities that I probably got from my parents, because I believe in genetics, that I went on the National Development Scheme for Senior Pharmacists in the year 2000. So,
Okay.
in fact, it was still, so actually I was still at Holton, I beg your pardon. So I was 10 years qualified then, 9 years qualified. And that was what you're talking about. That changed my understanding. I got some skills. I got some knowledge. I got to do it was really intense. We spent 2 whole weeks. It was up in Morpeth in Northumbria. It was a residential, so you can imagine what it was like.
Cool.
Middle of nowhere, had its own bar, say no more. But we worked incredibly hard. Like literally, we'd be like 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. And then we'd have to relax, obviously. So, but some of your guests, so Steve Tomlin, I met through that. Who else have you had? There were quite a few of them went on to become consultant pharmacists, and if they didn't, they went on to become chief pharmacists. Rob Duncombe was another one who you might know, and is a legend. Has been chief pharmacist in Christie in Manchester, and was at Children's Hospital. And he was in my little group, actually. So we had these little groups where you learn, you start doing Myers-Briggs and all that kind of stuff. And I suppose for the first time, and they were all pharmacists, but for the first time, Brian Smith was another pharmacist who was in Liverpool, and particularly Brian and Rob, and they won't mind me saying this because they'd say the same about me, is that I was like, ooh, your attitude to things is completely different to mine. Like, you can't say that. They go, yes, I can. So I learned a huge amount from that course. And my project was, when I said, I did the anticoagulant clinic thing just in my sleep, I didn't. It was actually, I decided to do it as my project for the National Development Scheme for Senior Pharmacists. So yes, in answer to your question, that's where I then got some of the knowledge and the further thinking about the change. Change is so important. And one of the other things that when I talk about change is that, and it links back to my medication safety, and I use this all the time whenever I do lots of presentations, but when I talk about some of my mantras, I suppose, is that don't find fault, find a remedy. Anybody can complain.
I like that one.
Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company. And so it so links to pharmacy because it talks about remedy. So for me, change is so important. And I've said before about thinking is underrated. But ultimately, success depends on clinical leadership. So you have to be prepared for change. And you also need to be able to get your allies, which is one of the words I used earlier. Because if you don't have allies, you can have the best ideas in the world and you could be really on it about change and know about change management. But if you don't have allies and you don't, obviously, communication is obviously a key word. But if you're not able to communicate, then you're not going to be able to make those things happen.
Yeah, that's true. And I love that. And I love that you're actually including these key words and phrases. They will resonate really well with people watching and listening for sure. So thank you for taking the time to think about what would be useful for my audience. That is, amazing. What led you to kind of leave hospital pharmacy and branch out to places like NHS England and then eventually branch out to a primary care network?
Sure. So when I was then, 2003, I was in Manchester and I became a consultant pharmacist. And part of that, again, Catherine Mackenzie told a similar story, was that at the time, it was like, okay, you've only got, for me, I had a B Pharm and a clinical diploma. And to meet the criteria to be a consultant, so I had all the 4 things. Okay, so I was already doing some limited research, but I was already doing research. I was doing plenty of leadership. I was already teaching because my post, forgot to say, but when I started, my post involved teaching undergrads on the pharmacy school. And it's lovely now, even now, people will stop me at conferences and say, oh, you taught me diabetes, back in whenever. And I remember you talking about this patient, it was this Asian taxi driver whose all his brothers had died due to heart attacks. And he was a smoker and he'd lived in his taxi and he didn't do any exercise. And I'd get the whole story about, the risks of cardiovascular disease or whatever. And they could still tell me what the story was. So I was doing all of that stuff. And the research part of it, I sort of took on and did a lot more of that. And I had to, for my credentialing, I had to agree to do a second degree. So I did a master's it was going to be a PhD, and they ran out of funding. And I tell you what, I did the MPhil, and I learned so much about academic rigor and even more questioning mind, even more why. But it nearly killed me. I finished it in 2010. It took me 3 years to do it while I was doing a full-time job. But I learned so much from it. But it was so hard because I don't think I'm actually that academically bright. I think I'm just smart. I think I'm just smart in the way I use, what I'm talking about, what I'm doing. But I found it incredibly hard. But I learned so much because I learned that, for example, I'll give you an example. My master's was I was asked, what do you want to do? And I said, I'm sure that we can improve the reporting of medication errors if we gave all our pharmacists PDAs, personal digital assistants back then, which is the pre-runner to like smartphones. And Darren Ashcroft, who was my academic supervisor, Professor Darren Ashcroft now, and Professor Peter Noyce, sadly no longer with us, said to me, whoa, you're way ahead of yourself, son, way ahead of yourself. And so the question didn't become that. The question became, what do we know about what influences people as to whether they do or don't report medication errors? I was about 4 steps ahead. My forward thinking was wrong. So I learned the academic rigor of needing to step back and go, no, that's not how you do. That's not how you ask an academic research question. You need to go right back to first principles. And so I learned a huge amount by doing that. So it was very, very hard work. But I did absolutely love it. And then because I then did that, and then I got quite a few publications working with Darren Ashcroft around prescribing and administration errors, took part in the EQUIP study, which was the massive study to do with prescribing errors by junior doctors. And I think that's probably one of my top 3 things I think I ever achieved was getting all the clinical pharmacy services managers in the whole of the Northwest to agree to take part in that study, because it was the pharmacists in the hospitals that did all the monitoring and looked and tried to see if there were any errors. And so that was one of the biggest things that I did, really. And so from there, I then decided that, I guess I was doing all these things at the hospital, but I was thinking about, did I want to do something different? And it became an opportunity. So I don't know if you know David Cousins, who's also no longer with us, but he was the lead on medication safety, probably in the world, but certainly in the UK. He was the National Patient Safety Agency. And he led that from the very beginning after it all kicked off in the early 2000s. And I'd been dealing with him for a while, and I'd done a huge amount of work on something called the medication safety thermometer, which was a national thing of trying to dip the temperature of like, what are the chances of incidents occurring on one day of the month to do with high risk medicine, so opiates, insulins, anesthetics, and so I was talking to David, and I knew he was going to retire, and so I said to him, I quite fancy your job. What do you think I should do? So I kind of sort of thought about it, and just carried on doing my stuff and doing stuff nationally and things. And then he did retire, and they interviewed, and I was successful in the interview, and I became the interim head of medication safety and medical devices at NHS England. This was in 2014-15. And I thought that was going to be my next job. I was actually prepared to almost give up my patient contact time, as much as I loved it, although I had an agreement that I would still do 1 session a month on the medical admissions ward. And I thought that was going to be my next job. I did it for about 6 months, and it was one of those turns when, again, NHS England ran out of money. And so they said, sorry, you're going to have to go back to your previous job, because I did it on secondment.
Yeah.
And I went back, and it just wasn't for me. I just couldn't get back into it. We'd had a change of leadership at the time, and I think, without going into too many details, we didn't get on. We were probably too similar in a lot of respects, and I decided that I didn't fit in here anymore and that I was going to move on. And I left.
Okay, cool. So some decisions were kind of made for you, some decisions you made on your own. How did it feel leaving patient care for those few months, even though you had a tiny bit of exposure? How did that feel for you?
I thought I would miss it more than I ever did. But actually, it was okay because I suppose I had sold myself the dream that somebody's got to take responsibility for making big decisions. And I thought that's what the job was. Well, I knew that's what the job was because that's what David Cousins did. He made some fundamental changes. So medication safety officers, right, which is mandatory in all organizations in England, that was David Cousins. And so going back to the leadership bit, okay, somebody's got to make the big decisions. And that person, I think, has got to have all of those things, those words that I've already mentioned. And I thought I could do that. And I knew that I could. I did it for 6 months. And they said, I'd done a great job. But so I actually missed it less than I thought because I think I prepared myself for the fact that I wasn't going to get it. But I was absolutely, there's no way I'm doing this unless I can do one session a month on medical admissions ward, which had always been my thing. I've pretty much been doing that since I was at Halton Hospital. I did it for nearly 20 years. So, yeah, I was ready for it, but it didn't work out.
Also, I mean, when you step out of a patient-facing role, I did it for the first time only 3 years after, after 3 years of being qualified as a pharmacist. When I moved to Dubai, because my husband was living there and I had to find a job and I couldn't find a job. It was really hard. It was a real challenge to have finished a residency in Oxford.
Yeah, I heard you say, yeah.
And not took 10, 11 months to find something. And the opportunity that I was given was in emergency services, but it was directly working with ambulances, paramedics, and
Formula One.
And Formula One, and kind of the strategy and leadership side, and changing law for the country. I mean, it was an incredible opportunity. And once I was in, it did upset me that it wasn't the job that I wanted, but I knew in order to stay in the country, it was an opportunity to get my foot in the door, get myself licensed, and then start building my network and my allies so that I could find other opportunities and build my knowledge. And knowledge is power. But it was quite a difficult experience for me because it was unexpected. I never thought that I was going to leave that patient-facing journey, but it did give me the opportunity to fully immerse myself in a completely non-patient-facing role where so many new skills that I didn't even know that I had emerged, from becoming a leader and understanding what that means to me and what type of leader that I am. Running projects and project management was a big thing, but then also education and training came into that.
Yeah.
Teaching paramedics from all over the world who were coming to join our organization as we grew exponentially was a big part of my role, was doing pharmacy induction for them and building a program for them to understand what medications we had, the laws around them, the clinical context as to what they were allowed to actually utilize in the ambulance, what doses they were allowed to use. They were so strict with rules. We had to be really clear from the beginning.
Yeah, I heard you say that before, yeah. But your knowledge base was allowed you, like I said before, it's the knowledge base that then allowed you to do those things, isn't it?
Yes.
People...
The residency... The residency was the foundation.
That's where you learned,
Yeah, that's where I learned so many of these skills. And then I got to focus on a few of those skills in those times. And that was a really incredible experience and one that I think has kind of made me who I am today. Yeah. Because it's just allowed me to explore other areas of pharmacy. And this is why pharmacy is so cool. We can do anything in this career that we are passionate about or we have interest in. But I do genuinely believe that building that foundation as a clinical pharmacist is a great way to start and then spread your wings, once you're kind of
that I'm 100% agreeing with you there.
Yeah. So, yes, tell us about your primary care network role, like that you're doing at the moment. Tell us some information about what you're up to.
So I moved from the northwest to the south. So I now live in Bournemouth. And when we moved here, I said to my wife, whose parents were living here at the time, so she was keen to move anyway. But I said, look, let's try and live as close as we can to the sea. So I cycle to work along the promenade, 7 miles of golden sand here. And I just love the lifestyle. But it means that I've now been there for nearly 8 years this year. And actually, I remember Bruce Warner, who was the deputy to David Cousins at MPSA, who then became the deputy chief pharmaceutical officer, recently, who knew me a little bit, said to me, I think you've really found your groove there, haven't you, Steve? And this idea that this advanced generalist who's an expert in medicines is, there's so many things I can fix, right? We've got 20,000 patients. A lot of them are on a lot of medicines. And my biggest passion of all really now is about problematic polypharmacy. And, I've got this saying that, if we just keep adding medicines all the time and never subtracting, we're just going to multiply the problems. And so that's just going to get more and more and more as we get people who live longer and longer with more and more morbidity. So we've got to get to the program. So I was very lucky. I got employed by a guy called Dr. Lawrence Brad, who's now a friend of mine. And he and I still do a lot of work together. We sit on national things. He's on the Royal College of GPs. I still sit on quite a lot of things to do with primary care with many other people. But it's all about how do we use pharmacy professionals, so pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, to realize and utilize pharmacy professionals to their best. And that's the where the expertise comes in now. So whether you're a pharmacy technician or pharmacist. So, and it's a captive audience. What I say about general practice is these patients are not going away. This is not like the man in bed 1 on AMU or the lady in bed 14 who I'll never see again in my life, probably. These patients are on our books and, till death do us part. And so all that stuff that needs dealing with, all that complexity, all that difficult stuff, all those people on dependence forming medicines, that requires relationships. And that's why I love it so much, because you feel like, and again, even for medication safety, so if we get an MHRA alert and it says there's a risk of, I remember this one, it was about hydrochlorothiazide and the risk of basal cell carcinoma. And I was able to press a few buttons or speak to the data analyst. And within 10 minutes, I knew we only had 3 patients in the whole of the practice who were on that medication. And we could speak to all of them and talk to them through, these are the risks, these are the benefits, what do you want to do? Bang, bang, bang. And it was done. So it was containable. And what was becoming a difficulty I found in the hospital was the speed at which people were moving through. You said before, we'd become, as much as I tried not to allow it to become, a lot of pharmacists and pharmacy technicians had become MR monkeys and discharge donkeys.
Yep.
And the ET in the middle, the extra thinking, as I used to call it, that was getting smaller and smaller as people spent less and less time there, unless they had they were in for a long haul and they were on ITU or they had specialist areas. But for a lot of the general medical patients, this is mainly what I work with, they just spent so little time there. So it now allows me to do, I'll give you the other word that I haven't given you yet, which is patient. And I know that sounds really obvious, but if you ever spoke to anybody that ever worked with me, they'd do this. They'd get their hands out and I would make my hands like a world and I'd say, we need to be holistic. We need to be more holistic and less atomistic. And that's this idea that, we've got to consider that person as a whole. And what you get in general practice is you get everything. You've got all the information. You've got everything at your fingertips. Anything that's ever been said is in a letter somewhere. It might be buried, but it's there. And you've got to keep seeing these people so you can build up a relationship. And so it's actually perfect for if you've got the skills to be able to be, you have to feel confident in dealing with multimorbidity. So the best part of my week is I do medication review clinics, half an hour appointments, and they're all people on more than 8+ medicines. So they've all got multiple conditions and they've got multiple medicines. Now, because Lawrence Brad worked out that the way that general practice works, one of its payment methods is you have to do these reviews. So if you're diabetic or you've had a stroke or you've got peripheral arterial disease, you need to have a review. Of course you do. Well, actually, I can do all of them at the same time. So it makes good business sense to the practice. But because of my background, because I worked in the diabetic clinic as well, I was trained to work in the diabetic clinic. So I'm not saying that's for everybody, but it does mean that actually you can be very, we can select the patients. So we select the patients down we can stratify down to who are the people that will probably get the most benefit from seeing somebody with my expertise. And that's how we do it. And we use pharmacy technicians. We've got less experienced pharmacists. We've got medicines, prescription clerks, and they're all part of the medicines team. And we work out who's the best person, who will be able to do this. So we get through huge amounts of work. But I think we are trying to get to the point of, and the other word I haven't given you yet, and the last word is excellence. And this is because this was the very first national service framework for coronary heart disease in 2000. And it was in the foreword. And it said, excellence requires that important, simple things are done right every time. And that has been one of my watchwords since that very beginning. And you know why? Because we've fallen into the perfection trap. And this is particularly difficult for pharmacy professionals, because myself included have had my own share of, mental health issues where the perfectionism can cause implosion. And so actually, whether you're a patient or a practitioner, there are very few things that we can actually attain perfection for. And we're not resourced for perfection, is the other way I would say it. So we need to go for excellence. So we go for excellence, not perfection. But we try to think about who's in the team. Is it an admin job? Is it a technical job? Is it a clinical job? And we try to, get the right people doing the right things. And we try to move the pharmacy technicians as far as we can to clinical, but there's technical to be done. And, sometimes pharmacists need to do technical, and our prescription clerks do a lot of admin, but we try to move them into the technical. So we're trying to move everybody up the scale, if you see what I mean. Mm. So, yeah, I love it. I absolutely love it.
Do you prefer the fast-paced emergency admissions area, or now are you feeling like this is, it's a hard question.
Okay.
When you
I can answer that.
Okay, cool. Go on then.
So until I got into it, I would have said it was always going to be AMU, because I would see all these people coming in with all these, let's be honest, nearly 20% now. I think the latest evidence is 16.5%, I think, of medical admissions, so non-elective medical admissions, are related to medicines. That's massive. So I'd see those every day. I went into the post-take ward rounds at 7:00 in the morning. What are we going to see today? And we'd see all of those things. But the point was, and the reason why I'm going to answer this question as I am, is that I can remember this lady. She was in bed 1 in the side room, and she'd had a not transplant. She'd had a heart operation, and she was in a really fit, right? She was in her late 80s, 90s, so fine. They said she was fit and go. But they just send her out on a standard dose of diuretics post-operatively. And she came in and she was pretty much dead. I mean, her urea was nearly 60. She was like a crisp. And I remember thinking, this is unacceptable. This is completely preventable, and it's unacceptable. And I'd see more and more people. I'd see all the people coming in with bleeds into their brain due to anticoagulation, people with stomach bleeds due to non-steroid, or aspirin for primary prevention. What are you doing? Why are you using primary prevention aspirin? The evidence is not there for that now. So I realized that I was working on the wrong side of the fence.
Yeah.
So going back to what I discovered before, I can run a search. I can find all the people on aspirin for primary prevention, and I can get the pharmacy technician or whoever to go through all of those and work out whether they still need it. And that's why I think primary care, for what I do and my knowledge, which is as a generalist around medicines and people with multimorbidity, I can do the most good working in primary care. But I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done it without having worked in medical admissions, in my opinion.
I absolutely agree. And I think it's really valuable for people to know, who are watching and listening, that it's really useful to move within the sectors to understand the perspective of each area of practice, whether it's community, hospital, GP practice. It's really good to see what's happening in each area so that you have that exposure.
Yeah.
And I always say to students, like when you're on placements, whether you're on internships, whether you're in your training year or a rotational band 6 pharmacist, is when you go on different areas, whether it's specialist ward areas or GP practices or the community pharmacy, start understanding the type of patients that you really enjoy seeing, and start fishing out those passions at an early stage so you can really hone in on your area of expertise. For me, I loved the emergency like admissions units for the fast-paced environment. I really loved
it's not
it
for
to
everyone.
absorb. Yeah, I loved it to absorb information.
Yeah.
But I crave long-term patient interaction. I crave relationship building. I crave being part of the patient's journey over a longer period of time. And knowing that information was just so valuable for me, because once I found pediatrics, I am now in palliative care. And a lot of the patients, yes, are acute, and in the hospital setting it is an acute situation, but most of our patients are in the community. So we're really fortunate to be able to work with parents and young children for weeks, if not months. So it's really nice.
Pediatrics is one of the few specialisms that are actually still holistically generalist. So pediatrics and geriatrics and probably intensive medicine are probably the only three left where you're really working as generalists.
I really love peds. I've only found it 4.5 years ago now. It's still early days, I'm still early in my journey. But I've definitely found something that I've fallen in love with. I'm 100% sure about that, which is great.
And I think, just going back to my point at the beginning, falling right into the advice trap, I'm going to reiterate what I said. This was my journey. You asked me what my journey is, but what I've tried to think about is, by using these words, is that, you could become the radiopharmacy expert, right? Or you could be working in cancer care or whatever. But I guess what I'm saying is that my 33 years have told me that if you think about patient, knowledge, why, communication, change, ally, and excellence, I think you'll do a better job.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. But before I let you go...
The Oral Apothecary.
Yeah, I can't go without asking you about the podcast.
My fellow podcasters,
exactly.
Jamie Hayes and Paul Gimpson, would be, they wouldn't allow me to not mention it.
They would be so disappointed. Yeah, dude, tell me everything in a nutshell in terms of why you created it and what the podcast is all about, so I can share the links to it in the show notes and all of that. Yeah.
So there's a word for this, isn't there, when a podcaster comes on somebody else's podcast. I think Alistair talks about it on The Rest is Politics. Pedultery, that's what it is. This is an act of pedultery. Anyway, it was during COVID. Jamie Hayes, I mentioned before, he was interested for a long time about doing a podcast. And so he asked me if I would do it. He had a friend called Paul Gimpson, who used to be head of RPS in Wales and is interested in improvement science. I'd never met Paul for a whole year. So we started it during podcast. We started the podcast during lockdown, late 2020. And we think the first episode went out in February 2021. And we're now up to nearly 70 episodes. And it's a podcast about medicines. So rather than, and we joke about it. I mean, we are three pharmacists. We say like we're three educators. We're one clinician, that's me, one improvement scientist, that's Paul, and one coach, that's Jamie, because he's an executive coach with 100 years of experience. What's not to like? So, but the key is the guests that we get on. They all come on and we took a different angle, like we've just discussed before. We might do pediatrics, we might do HIV, we might do prison healthcare, we might do geriatrics. We would do quite a lot about shared decision-making and person-centered care. And we've had doctors, nurses, we've got a physio on next week, we've had paramedics, we have all sorts of people. But we believe that where there are medicines, there are stories. And so when the guest comes on, we talk to them about what they're currently doing, but they get asked to give us three things. One is a desert island drug, so a drug that has a very powerful memory for them, a career piece of music, a career anthem that defines their career, and a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. And that's it in a nutshell. And it's like, we call it pub chat. So a bit like this, but there are three of us plus the guest. I'm sure it's very daunting for the guest, actually, thinking about it. But we pretend that we're in the pub. It doesn't matter whether you're drinking alcohol or a cup of coffee. And we try to make it as if we're talking in the pub. And we started off as CPD in the pub. And that's it. And it's available on all the platforms that yours is, Pharmacist Diaries, is available as well.
I love that. I will definitely share that in the show notes. You'll look forward to my superhero YouTube thumbnail.
Are you gonna do a cartoon?
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be you and then the cartoon. I can't wait.
Excellent. I look forward to it.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to be you in some superhero pants.
Yeah. Well, they're positive, though. They're positive pants.
Yeah, agreed. Positive pants all the way. Thank you so much for your time today, your energy, your effort, and the absolute love that you've given my audience. This has been a really entertaining episode as well as an inspiring one. Loved hearing about your story, but also it's really nice to have a conversation with someone who has taken care to think about who's listening into the podcast and what type of information that would be useful for them. And I think it's applicable not only to the younger generation, but we've got listeners who have 20, 30, 40 years of experience as well. So I look forward to getting this episode out there, and thank you for making a connection with me.
Thank you very much for having me on. It was a real pleasure.